What really resonates with me about what we've heard today is about the importance of measurement. I spent 25 years negotiating with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs measurements of tax liabilities following alleged errors in tax accounting. And there's quite a lot of overlap between what you've been talking about and that world, strangely. It's quite a lot of interpretation involved in what these measurements mean. And of course, the issue that one of the speakers raised earlier about differences in language becomes very important if you're trying to understand what measurements actually mean. Another thing I'm slightly conscious of, though, from being in the rather isolated world of taxation, is that science, I imagine, can be a world in which perhaps you mix with other scientists. Well, when I was in my rarefied tax world, I had occasion to study the laws of riverways, riparian law, and the way in which pollution is managed where a river crosses certain jurisdictional borders. And the law is actually so old, so antiquated, and not really fit for modern day purpose. And neither actually are capital markets. And capital markets are the destination of the information that we seek to collect and deliver through corporate climate change related reporting, which is what I wanted to talk to you about today. Now, corporate climate related reporting is the way in which companies disclose to their investors and stakeholders the effect that climate change is having on the resources and relationships on which they depend to operate. It's the way that they describe the context in which they're operating, the market conditions, and how climate change is affecting them. They talk in their reports about the climate change related effects of their own organisation's activities. Although, as we'll come on to talk about, I'm never entirely sure whether and to what extent a company is actually able or entitled to determine what those effects might be in the long term. They talk about the risks and opportunities presented to their organisation by climate change, how the organisation manages those risks and opportunities and governs them. They also measure their greenhouse gas emissions, and as we'll see, there's what one might describe as rather a state of anarchy in greenhouse gas emissions measurement among corporations, through no fault of their own, but there's a lot of different approaches that one can take. They talk about the results that they've achieved against the targets, the mitigation and adaptation targets that they've set, and also about any instruments that they trade or are delivered to them which are designed for climate change mitigation purposes. But the crucial role of all of this reporting, it's part of the accounting system, if you like. There are lots of accountants involved in this particular discipline. Accountants seek to get a true and fair picture of measurements and information. And something I've learned from working with the National Physical Laboratory is how you look at the provenance of measurement. And it seems a very important principle that we could learn in the accounting world about the provenance of measurements to reassure the reader that what they are reading is true and fair, whatever that means. They say that accounting makes economic entities visible, and that visibility has some consequences in the way that the reader interprets it and acts upon it. Yeah, so there are lots of reasons for companies to report nowadays. There's quite a lot of law requiring companies to report their greenhouse gas emissions and on the risks and opportunities that climate change presents to them. There's law in the US, France, Australia, Europe, quite a lot of jurisdictions requiring companies to make disclosures of this nature. Stock exchanges impose requirements. There are demand from all sorts of stakeholders, including from investors. The organisation that I work for, the Carbon Disclosure Project, of which the Climate Disclosure Standards Board is a special project, the Carbon Disclosure Project acts on behalf of institutional investors to collect climate change related information from their investees and potential investees. So that's partly where the demand comes from. And of course there are UN agencies that have sustainable development goals that are encouraging companies to make these kinds of disclosures. Reporting guidelines, voluntary and mandatory, are a lot more available now, which helps companies to report on climate change. And in fact, lots of companies actually use climate change related reporting as a kind of a marketing tool, if you like, to show that they are doing things to support sustainable development objectives. So as I say, you can see from this table here, this slide, that there's been a huge increase in the incidence of climate change related reporting by companies. In the top graph shows you the investors that support the Carbon Disclosure Project. So in 2003, we were supported by 35 institutional investors controlling $4.5 trillion worth of assets. And now that's moved up to 2012, where signatories to our project, 655 institutional investors controlling $78 trillion worth of assets. So it is on their behalf that we write to companies to ask them to make disclosures. And then the bottom graph here shows you the incidence of reporting by companies. So we had 235 companies reporting in 2003, and in 2012 it's actually gone up to about 4,100. And Secretary General Figueres has compared CDP, the information we collect, to being a bit like an X-ray. You can see what's going on inside the business. Well, because of the increase in the instance of reporting, we now find that information is reported in all sorts of different channels, through annual reports, in filings to regulators, in company-generated corporate sustainability and social reporting mechanisms, to environment agencies such as the EPA in the USA, through not-profit organisations like CDP and the Global Reporting Initiative, but also this information is now being fed direct into the sorts of terminals on which institutional investors rely for their decision-making, such as Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters. This is why, partly, why and how investors use this information to look into sustainable investing. Lots of different definitions of that. They're changing all the time. But instead of putting their assets into fossil fuels, for example, to see whether there are other technologies that their cash can support. So there's been a big increase in sustainable investing and in the use of the type of information that is fed direct from the Carbon Disclosure Project system into Bloomberg. You can see that there were 1 million CDP data points downloaded every 6 weeks. It's a lot of interest by investors, isn't it? Maybe something that it's just the thing I think that Hilary and Martin wanted me to come to talk to you about today, that the measurements on which some of the information is based that goes through to Bloomberg could really benefit, I think, from the input of the science community, so to help investors understand what it actually means. So you can see from this that all types of financial institutions are using climate change related information. And I think the investors are now wise to the fact that there is a correlation between good financial performance and good climate change related disclosure. The green and blue lines refer to indices that the Carbon Disclosure Project prepares, which assess the quality of disclosure and carbon performance in terms of target setting and performance against those targets. So the blue and green lines show the indices that CDP sets, and the red line shows total returns, financial performance. So there's a correlation between the two, but those in the indices seem to exceed the sort of average financial performance of the Global 500. course, corporations don't do this for no reason. There are drivers, as we've said, the legal, stock exchange and stakeholder drivers, but also they find benefits. They find benefits in terms of identifying efficiencies within their organisation, and also they start to appreciate the links between the use of what we might describe as different forms of capital. Mostly, reporting to date has looked at the use of financial capital and results based on that. But now companies are starting to understand that natural, human, social capital, manufactured capital also have a very great impact on the way in which they can sustain financial performance. And we're developing new metrics for communicating on the use of different types of capital all the time. So there are benefits to the corporation as well of reporting. The thing is, though, that climate change reporting can no longer be seen in isolation from any other form of sustainability reporting, or in fact from economic problems, economic growth, financial growth, and in fact social problems. So in a recent report by that came out of this year's Davos World Economic Forum conference, Christine Lagarde, for example, said that climate change is an economic challenge, and the president of the World Bank linked climate change with development gains or not. So we're finding that there's this tension between needing to find accurate measurements of things like greenhouse gas emissions, but also translating that into what it means in wider economic and development and social terms. That's becoming a challenge, and we haven't really even got corporate measurements of greenhouse gas emissions sorted out yet. These problems are all becoming conflated. What this adds up to is that the sort of measurements that you're working on, the sort of reporting that I'm working on, become an enabler for our overall response to climate change. The physical measurements, the scientific verifiable measurements, are important for the way in which we decide how to respond to climate change. There are political decisions that need to be made, political responses, which also in part rely upon the credibility of those measurements. There are market-enabling instruments and structures and markets that are coming out that is designed to mitigate climate change. Loads of financial accounting rules now starting to come out about the measurement of different forms of capital other than financial capital. And of course there are social and environmental responses that we need to make whereby the efficiency of them needs to be determined by reference to how we measure it. Now, because of all these, because of the seriousness of climate change, because of people starting to realise that reporting and measurement makes these problems visible, tangible, and enables those seeking to respond to climate change to assess how efficient the response is. Lots of different rules have come out from lots of different actors. So, as we said earlier, we have legislation coming out from regulators on mandatory reporting. There are a few examples there. The National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act in Australia that requires companies to report on their greenhouse gas emissions, lots more. This list isn't up to date. There are voluntary reporting schemes. There are supporting verification standards. There are standards on reporting, which is what my own organisation seeks to create some standardisation of language to enable the reader to be able to understand what they're reading, and stock exchanges are also acting. In fact, Martin and I'm not sure if Rod and Jane will know that I've been working on trying to compile a list of all of this activity for years, and I'm tracking, monitoring and recording the activity of any organisation who writes something or does something that directly or indirectly has an effect on which companies report on climate change and sustainability. At the moment, I have 340 organisations on that list, each of them producing numerous products to help with climate change measurement, assessment, reporting. It's a lot. It makes me wonder, why are there so many? And hearing you talk about standardisation, it's really similar to what we're trying to do at the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. We've been working with the OECD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and the Global Reporting Initiative to look at whether and to what extent there is consistency in this measurement, whether there is consistency in reporting, language, assessment, performance. We can see that the inconsistency between the different outputs we see from companies is at variance with the nature of the risks associated with climate change and its global nature. It produces so much variation in the quality and quantity of the outputs that it's very difficult for investors and others to understand what the information needs. And of course it's arguably unnecessary, because a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon. Or is it? Is it? That's one of my burning questions for this community, and poor old Martin and Jane, they've heard me ask it over and over again. How do we know whether Shell's ton of carbon is the same as BP's ton of carbon? What is it? You know, if you're a young research analyst sitting in Goldman Sachs or something, how do you know what to make of what Shell reports and what BP reports? Can you say, yes, I can compare them? I think lots of investors do actually struggle with that. And even though I really want to know that answer, and I have since 2004, I still don't feel confident about whether there is this consistency and coherence that Martin spoke about earlier. Somebody said in a report about this, how do we verify this stuff if we don't really understand the provenance of the measurement, the standard against which the measurements have been made? And they said it sends our CFO into outer orbit because we use the word uncertainty. You know, we can't be confident about what we can verify. It makes our CFO pass out, not to mention our shareholders. So what we need for this purpose is something stable, comparable, and coherent, just as Martin said earlier. Yes, just to give you an example, I know you're running short of time now, so I'll just point out that if you are a group of companies operating in the UK, the US and Denmark, you can potentially be asked to make disclosures about climate change, including your greenhouse gas emissions, for the following reasons. To comply with obligations under the EU emissions trading scheme, to comply with the US EPA's what they call the mandatory reporting rule, their greenhouse gas reporting scheme, to comply with the UK CRC scheme, and also we have the prospect of mandatory carbon reporting in the UK now under the Companies Act in Director's Report. There's draft legislation on statute which we expect to come into force in October 2013. So you have up to you have up to 4 different legislative imperatives to report. And then you will also report under the Danish Financial Statements Act, the Danish Green Accounts Act, for voluntary reporting purposes to CDP. Maybe you're producing a CSR report, and you maybe want to participate in specialist indices which require you to report, like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So, of course, this is another quote from some research done by the University of Sydney. You get yourself into a situation where you may be doing things and you may think it's the right thing to do, but unless you can measure what's happened previously and what the benefits were and what the outcome was, how do you know what the things are you should focus on moving forward? We have a finite amount of resources. So in the case of my own organisation, CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, what we seek to do is to promote, through the development of a framework, some standardisation of reporting on risks and opportunities, governance, strategy, performance and measurement of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have actually developed a climate change reporting framework. We've just issued edition 1.1 actually of this framework, but we don't seek to create anything new. What we're seeking to do through this standard is to enshrine the highest common denominator of best practice, if you like. I'm afraid that's the best non-scientific way I can put it. But so we don't want to create a measurement standard for corporate greenhouse gas emissions reporting, for example. What we want to know is, if and to the extent that a company does have these different reporting obligations to the US, to Australia, if you take a company like Rio Tinto, it probably has more than 10 statutory reporting obligations for greenhouse gas emissions. What we need to know and to communicate to investors is there some equivalence between those different measurements? If Rio Tinto prepares a corporate inventory, here is my consolidated account of all my greenhouse gas emissions around the world. But those figures have been prepared by reference to different jurisdictional requirements. How can that total be made coherent? And I think it's something you were talking about earlier. But again, I go back to the young research analyst. How will they know? How will they compare with other metals and mining companies? So what we'd really like from the science community is to understand, A, if different measurement approaches are used as specified by regulators, does it make sense to add them up? Does your total really mean anything? And B, what would you recommend? I mean, we point in this framework to other bodies of work, so that if and to the extent that you want to make a statement about the way in which you govern climate change matters, then look at the work of the International Corporate Governance Network, for example, a standard that they produce, or the Financial Reporting Council Stewardship Standard. And in the same way, we want to be able to report to greenhouse gas measurement standards and say what they mean and communicate that to investors. So, I'm nearly finished, sorry to take your time. There are lots of technical challenges with this sort of reporting. I read the other day, somebody said, an unstoppable fount of complexity has been uncorked, and it certainly does feel like that when we have our technical working group meetings. Companies, this type of reporting is not based on the same sort of underlying presumptions as normal corporate reporting. It's not just to do with financial responsibility. It's not just to do with maximising profit for shareholders. It's to do with responsibility in wider terms. Your responsibility to the planet, to future generations. You're meant to be showing in your corporate reporting how you're securing intergenerational equity for resource use, etc. I won't go through all these different challenges we're facing, but on the greenhouse gas measurement and uncertainty front, I think I've shared with you what we would like from the science community if you're able to help us with that. But the one thing I wanted to end on with this slide is that I'm not really qualified to talk about this, but it seems to me that things like measurements are linear. But what's required, if you read the outputs, for example, from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, from the government of China, is that we need to be looking at the effect of measurements in more of a systems way, a holistic way, where we look at what's known as a circular economy, whereby things that are produced and manufactured, you can tell at the point of sale what the ultimate recycling of the various outputs from the use of that product will be. So certainly in consumer goods, for example, with clothing, where will that clothing end up when it's discarded by the buyer? How will it be fed back into the cycle of resources so as to keep the system whole, I suppose? Probably a bit like the thinking of James Lovelock and his Gaia theory. But how can we use measurements to convey that to an investor? I really don't know, but I suspect you know. And I'm just going to end up with this. I love this quote from Thomas Berry. I'm very, very conscious that I'm posing more questions to you and I don't have more answers. But one thing I do know is this. We can be sure that whatever fictions exist in Wall Street bookkeeping, the earth is a faithful scribe, a faultless calculator, a superb bookkeeper, and we will be held responsible for every bit of our economic folly. And I'd just like to add, unless you help us do something about it. So thank you.